Hello and welcome to the For My Dogs podcast. If this is your first time listening, we are a podcast that exists to help men become the best version of themselves and to highlight that they cannot do that alone. My name is Tucker and we have a great episode for you today. My pastor and boss, Anson Hanbury, is coming on to talk about leadership, leading people through seasons of change specifically, because that's a very difficult thing to do, and also his battle and struggle with anxiety and the things that have helped him have victory and healing in that area. And so we hope that you enjoy this episode and get a lot out of it, take a lot of notes, and thank you for listening to the episode. Enjoy. All right, welcome to the For My Dogs podcast. Spring has sprung, so I had to bust out the Hawaiian shirt this time. There's pollen everywhere, and if you have allergies really bad, that's not fun for you. But for me, it means warm weather's coming, so I'm very excited. We have an exciting episode today for you. Unfortunately, Johnny won't be able to join us for this one, but with Easter just around the corner and all that comes with that holiday season, we wanted to bring on my pastor, my boss, Anson Hanbury, and just have him share about some of his leadership experiences and just experiences with mental health. And so I'm going to pitch it over to him to introduce himself a little bit more.
Well, Tucker, thanks for having me on. Looking forward to the conversation. And I love the topics that you tackle in here. Things like leadership and ministry, like we talk about, but also friendship and connecting with other people and other guys in particular. So those are values for me. And I like hearing you kind of share some of the stories from what you guys are doing here. So yeah, like Tucker said, I'm Anson Hanbury. The quick stats, been married 25 years. I got 5 kids, born and raised in Jacksonville, Florida. Spent 13 years in the Chicago area before coming here to Lake Norman, the north part of Charlotte, for the last 3 years. And we're here to stay. I learned I'm a halfback. So went north from the south and then halfway back to where I came from. So happy to be that. But my guess is the stuff you guys care about is I grew up bleeding orange and blue. And so
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
all the dogs were bad news in my world growing up. So my earliest memories in the 80s was of Herschel Walker just like trampling the Gators all the time. So they beat us 44-0 one year. That one stands out. I don't know what year that was, but yeah, in the 80s, just when Florida was getting dominated by Georgia, that was rough. And then I remember Peyton Manning coming along. One Gator claim to fame is that Peyton Manning never beat the Gators in the Danny Werfel era.
No, he did not.
That's pretty
unfortunately.
Good. Yeah.
You guys have had our number for a long time. It's very, very frustrating. Up until recently. I
was going to say, yeah. And here lately, so I told you, I used to bleed orange and blue. I mean, I was like, kind of like you are now. Like I was all the scouting reports of the high school players and everything. And football was the main thing, although basketball came along and it's pretty good there for a while too. And it's cool to see them back in the championship. But yeah, for me, at least on the football side, it was the Will Muschamp era that broke me. Like Florida became so unwatchable in those years that I kind of drifted away. And now I pay attention some, but man, not like I used to. But now Tennessee and Georgia both they're outpacing Florida by a long way for a long time now. So
yeah, I don't know. We'll see. You guys, they're liking Florida's chances this year, so we'll see what happens. And we play in the Swamp this year, which is I don't know the last time we won there.
Yeah.
So I don't have high hopes for that game, but we shall see. But yeah, y'all's basketball team was great this year.
Yeah. Yeah. So people from Jacksonville, the off season is the best season for football. Like once the Jaguars start playing, you get a couple of games in, and all the hopes are gone. Florida, sadly, a lot of times lately the same way. So
yeah, you sound like a lot of battered Tennessee fans going through the 2 decades of just ineptitude with the coaching cycle, and finally, it feels like we stabilized a little bit, thankfully. So
hopefully they can figure it out in Gainesville too.
Yeah, it takes time, and with NIL and transfer portal and stuff, you never know.
Yeah,
and I think they got a good quarterback, so that always helps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we got spoiled in the early 2000s.
Yeah,
with
for
Urban
sure.
Meyer and Billy Donovan and the championships that were all back to back. Those were good years. But
Yeah,
anyway,
that was crazy. I watched a documentary about that whole
did you?
time period, yeah, with Urban Meyer and like Aaron Hernandez stuff. And
Mm-hmm.
it was just, yeah, behind the scenes look at everything. But those
Yeah,
teams were absolutely loaded
yeah,
with NFL talent. It was crazy.
no question. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. And just for our listeners, I just want to share like one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is just in your time at our church, you have led with a vulnerability and honesty about
Mm-hmm.
experiences that you've had, specifically surrounding mental health. And so, um, I
Mm-hmm.
knew you'd be a great person to come on just to kind of talk and share through that. But before we get into that part of your story, just want to kind of walk us up to there. So, how long have you held a senior position of leadership in church ministry?
Yeah. So I've been in church ministry close to 25 years, all together from like seminary days of serving in churches, through today. In 2012 was probably the big transition for me from like a ministry leadership role to more of a senior leadership role. So the senior pastor of the church where I had been serving, he was there for 19 years. He transitioned out. And so I served as an interim pastor for a year while also interviewing for kind of the full-time senior role, and then was hired into that role in 2013. And that was a season where the church had it was in need of revitalization, and so it had declined quite a lot in the latter years of my predecessor there, um, and then from there actually led wasn't looking for it, never would have asked for it, but we wound up merging with a larger church in our area. So I wound up leading a merge. We were a smaller church. We became part of a multi campus larger church. So I transitioned from senior pastor of a small church to basically an executive pastor function and then a formal executive pastor role in a larger church for the next 8 years. And then for the last 3 years have been down here. So since 2013 years in more of a senior level leadership capacity, either in the lead role or a number two to that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So, what you actually gave us the opportunity to go up and see the church you served as an executive
Mm-hmm.
pastor at and experience a little bit of the Chicago suburbs, which was at that time the furthest north I had ever been in the
Mm-hmm.
United States. So, thank you for giving me the
That was cool.
opportunity
I was glad
to,
we got to do it.
yeah, get out of my comfort zone a little bit here in the South. But yeah, that was a cool experience, and our church has been really blessed having you here and helping us navigate our own season of
Mm-hmm.
change. So
Mm-hmm.
that's been a lot of fun. So in those experiences, I know each one's different, and each one, comes with its different challenges, but also different joys. What are some of the biggest lessons you've learned along the way through serving in those different roles?
Yeah, yeah. Um, so probably the first lesson that comes to mind because I've told the story enough times actually was preceded my time in Chicago. The first church I served in, I was there for 2 years in Clearwater, Florida. It was right out of seminary, and big lesson about what not to do. From that first season in ministry, which those are valuable lessons too. Um, the lesson there that sticks out with me is don't try to answer questions nobody's asking you,
Mm,
because that's what I did. I was young guy, fresh out of seminary. I felt like I knew all the answers, and I had my opinions and assessments of the issues in the church and of the leaders that were above me and the decisions they were making and all the things. And so I felt like the best way I could serve the church was by sticking my nose in all sorts of areas that weren't really my lane, but I wanted to kind of fix everything. There was a really wise elder, and by elder, I don't mean like older guy, although he was older than me, but he served on the elder council, the governing, body of the church. And we were having breakfast one day, and he was very kindly trying to help me by saying, the best thing you can do is, knock it out of the park in your area, right? In your area of ministry that we hired you for. And he was in a kind way saying, probably spend less energy trying to lead other people's areas and focus on your own. I didn't have ears to hear it. Honestly, I wound up getting fired from that position. Not because I was wrong, because actually, in hindsight, a lot of the things that I believed to be true actually were true. And looking back, I was probably right about more things than I was wrong about, but it didn't matter because they weren't areas of my business. So it's not about being right. It's about knowing where to exercise your influence and where to spend your time and energy and where not to. So that was it was a painful lesson to me, but when they hurt, they kind of stick with you. So
Yeah.
hopefully, I've done a better job since then of leaning into the areas of responsibility that are given to me and doing my best there. That's hard. I mean, it's hard to do, especially if you care.
Yeah.
And when there's stuff around you that's just not going that great, right? Like
Hmm.
legitimately, there's a pull for anybody who's got some energy and care and high capacity to go. All right, I think I can fix this thing. But that was one big lesson. Um, I think another one that stands out is when you're in a leadership role and people are asking you, to step into some of these things, you got to do it. Like, if you're the leader, you got to lead. And that's one where I've been under leaders that frustrated everybody because there's only so much that other people can lead around you. Like when you're in that spot, if you're not leading the way forward, you're frustrating everybody. I
Hmm.
think of it like, an analogy of like a team of horses or a team of dogs, like pulling a dog sled. And you've got like kind of your lead horses at the front, and let's say they're all kind of lined up, right? You might have 6 or 8 horses in line, and whichever one of those lead horses is the lead, none of the rest of the team can go faster than that horse is going, right? And so if you're not setting the pace, then nobody wins, And then in that, kind of following that same analogy, you go too fast and you're yanking on everybody's chain and they're getting jerked around. Well, that's going to be hard for people to follow and keep pace. If you're going too slow and there's people are running up against each other, so it's finding that balance, right? That pace of leadership. But fundamentally, I mean, leaders got to lead, and you never know all the answers, and you're never 100% sure, but you got to have the courage to step out and take a chance and do some things. So those are a couple of things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, with what you're saying, that first lesson of you learned what not to do. I feel like anybody who's like young in a position of leadership, I feel like it is almost inevitable that your pride has to get destroyed. And that was true for me stepping into
Mm-hmm.
ministry. Like I came in, yeah, thinking I knew like this is the way church needs to be done. This is the way preaching needs to be done,
Mm-hmm.
XYZ, you name it. I just, gone to school for it in seminary and you come
Mm-hmm.
out and being like, all right, I want to put all this stuff to use. And then you start working with people and it's just like, dude, this is not about you. Like there's so many things happening that the Lord's doing that he could do with or without you. And
Mm-hmm.
going about it in a prideful, like, I know all the right answers way is just not the way Jesus intended us to do ministry. But I feel like it applies to leadership roles, even in the corporate world too. Like,
Sure.
I mean, you listen to guys like Simon Sinek and, people like that, they'll say one of the biggest keys to leadership is putting your employees or whoever's under you, putting them first and
Mm-hmm.
listening to their needs and what they're, bringing to the table and, um, delegating and empowering them to do the positions you've hired them for. And so, yeah, that was a learning process for me too.
Mm-hmm.
Luckily, I learned that lesson before coming to our church,
Mm-hmm.
which was helpful, and then even
Yeah.
grew in that even more since being here. And so,
Yeah.
but it is hard. It's hard to like stay in your lane, but it is what's best for you. And that's one thing I appreciate about your leadership style is you do a really good job of like helping protect all of us so that we
Mm-hmm.
can stay in our lane and focus on what we need to
Mm-hmm.
focus on, which I think is really important for leaders to do. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
I just want to
Yeah.
say I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying it, and I would affirm, your role as well, and what I see in you, and the growth that the steps that you've taken intentionally, and kind of organically over the last few years. I mean, it's really cool to see, and it's one of these things that you just got to do it. It's experience is a great teacher.
Hmm.
The more you get, um, yeah, I think in all of this too, the truism that I mean, it's well worn, it's nothing new, but nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yeah.
And it's just true, you know?
Yeah.
And you just learn both for yourself, like the kind of leaders that you want to follow are the ones that care about you. And it helps if they know some things. Yeah, that's true. But they can know everything in the world. And if it's obvious that, they don't really care about you or maybe the mission or the cause or whatever it is, then it's not going to go anywhere. But that one, and it's a good reminder too, because it's so easy to get outcome focused, right? And you get caught up
Hmm.
in the whirlwind of accomplishing stuff and getting things done. At least for me, it's I have to sort of catch myself and go, nobody cares how much I know if they don't know how much I care, and
Hmm.
so stop and make those connections with people and put myself in their shoes. I mean, learning to do that both in an intentional, disciplined way and in an organic way, um, that makes a big difference too, especially when
Yeah.
you're trying to change some things.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a perfect transition to the next
Yeah.
question. So yeah, you touched on it briefly, but a
Hmm.
lot of your positions in leadership have been in times of
Hmm.
seasons of change where you're, helping a church transition into, a new beginning, a new life cycle. That can be an incredibly difficult thing in any
Hmm.
organization, let alone a church, where a lot of these things that people love and prioritize, they hold as sacred. Like it's a little bit different. And so I would love for you to speak to how, lessons you've learned as far as like best practices, but also what not to do when it comes to just leading change, because that can be
Yeah.
such a difficult thing. And I've seen you come in and have to do it here almost right out the gate when you got hired here. And so, yeah, I would love to just hear more about what you've learned about doing that over the years.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah. For whatever reason, I didn't ask for it. I didn't expect it. I didn't want it. God has put me in places that are in seasons of change, even from the first place that I served full time. And I'll try to connect it to broadly. It's not just people in church ministry, because you're right. I mean, I think what I've learned over the years is leadership is leadership. People are people. The fundamentals are the same. There's so much transfer. A healthy organization is a healthy organization, whether it's a church or you're making widgets or whatever, because people are people, and we function the same. Now there are differences, obviously, but I think there's more similarities than there are differences.
Mhm.
So God put me in organizations that were in some level of crisis. So that's kind of just the crucible that I've learned leadership in. And I think that's what made my first kind of full-time post so difficult. I was not in the senior leadership role, but I felt like I knew what leadership should be and should look like. And it was just, I mean, outside of my own experience there, it was kind of a train wreck all over. There was a lot of carnage in that situation. So I went from there, taking the lessons that I had learned about not sticking my nose in where nobody was asking me, to another situation where, yeah, I mean, the organization, the church as an organization, had declined to the point where just the resources were so depleted. And by resources, I mean hard resources like finances and facilities. The facilities had been so many maintenance issues that were long overdue. The financial situation was worse and worse, just in terms of amount of money in the bank and budget to work with, but also the human resources, the people who had been carrying the water, and serving and leading and doing all the things were just spent. And so something had to change. And I think the big learning there is in that situation. And that's the one where we wind up merging with another local church that took us in. And for those who aren't in the church world, like mergers and acquisitions in the church, very similar to a merger and acquisition, outside the church. We try to make it a more spiritual thing, but honestly, it's very much the same kind of dynamic. It's hard. It's hard for both the the organization that's being enfolded into the larger organization, and it's also hard for the larger organization that's trying to create some kind of chemistry and synthesis with the new one. So that's a challenge. But that first, I was 2 years in the senior role there, and it just became clear that we just waited too long to change, to even propose meaningful change. And when you look back, you can see clearly. Hindsight's always 2020. So there was a season of, at that church, I think 7 years from 2005 2012, of just consistent, steady decline in everything. Attendance, giving, programmatic impact, just health and vitality in the church, all the things. All the metrics are going the wrong direction. But year over year, the story you would hear was, well, this thing happened this year, so that's why we declined from here to here. And then the story this year was, oh, well, so and so left, and there was that issue, and so we went from here to here. And every year had its own story to tell. But when you look back, there's just a consistent thread of decline over all these years that's it's kind of a smoother line than anybody would have thought. Like in your mind, if you're living it, you think, oh, it kind of went like this, and then we were good for a while, and then it went like this, and we're good for a while. But in actuality, it was much more consistent than that. And I think it's a symptom of a lack of vision. Like if the people don't know where they're going, if there's no rallying energy and focus to whatever the organization is, my experience in a church, the mission that God has given us in whatever location and community that we're in, like if we can't agree on that and have some mutually energizing mission to rally around, my experience, once the arrow starts to tip downward, it starts to go. And actually in that leadership season became good friends, and God sent me a great mentor who had led turnaround change in a couple of businesses. So he was not a church guy, he was a faithful Christian, served the church, but a great business leader and had been very, very successful. But I mean, he had gone a hard path, right? And he could tell the story of, turnaround change and the relative difficulty of it, depending on how long you've been in decline. And so, ideally, the best leaders are able to discern, like, okay, every organization has a life cycle, right? That's sort of a fundamental thing. Everything grows, plateaus, and declines. The question is, when are you going to start a new growth cycle? And in the ideal, what got you from here to here, there'll be a new vision to take you from here to here. In reality, most organizations, it takes a little while of kind of coming down the hill before the alarm bells start going off. Like, wait a second,
Yeah.
doesn't feel like it did when we were up here. Now we're here. Now's the time to change. In my first leadership post, like we were down here, and like the sustainability threshold, I mean, was long since in the rearview mirror, and so it creates a ton of pressure around the pace of change and the radical. I mean, how drastic the changes need to be, how fast the changes need to be in order to even have a chance of just not flatlining. And in that first situation, by God's grace, He gave us an opportunity to join up with a much, much healthier organization, a much, much healthier church that we became a part of. And that's how He revitalized it. And that was great, which gave me a whole filter and a lens, for coming to our church, And I think one of the things that you just got to do is ask honest questions. You learn the questions to ask over the years. When you lived it, you go, all right, I remember what that was like. Now I know what to ask, of this other situation. I came into this leadership role not even sure how well my questions would be received, but I felt like they were the questions that needed to be asked. So I was very, kind, but forward and direct about, hey, where's the church at? What's the financial position like? What's been the sort of the patterns of engagement in the church with the congregation? What are the numbers like? Just give me the, give me the numbers. Which somebody told me along the way, when you're talking about whatever the activity is, right or wrong, this individual was like, hey, people who do stuff use numbers. People who don't use words. And that may have a little bit harder, not 1,000% true in every case, but the point being, like, measurable impact. Things that are real are measurable, and things that get measured get attention and growth. Um, and when we're trying to paint a picture that's better than reality, we'll talk, we'll kind of use
Yeah.
descriptors and language and all these things, and we'll kind of avoid anything that points to a measurable. So I'm asking for a lot of measurables, coming in, and like you said, we've kind of hit the ground running, and what I tried to do was just be clear and open-handed with everybody and say, hey, here's reality as I see it. Here's where we're at. Here's where we're doing well. Here's where we have some room for growth. Try to pull a bunch of people around me so it wasn't just me saying it. So
Hmm.
I'm just sort of becoming the mouthpiece for what I'm hearing from people in the church, and kind of hold up a mirror and say, hey, here's where we are. It's not good or bad. It's just an is. Every organization of every stripe goes through life cycles, and it's time for change. If we want to have a renewed impact and be around for another, in our case, 43, 44 years, because that's how long our church has been around, then we're going to need to reach the next generation. And doing the things that we did to reach the last generation are probably not going to be the things to reach the next one. And so try to put as much objective criteria around that. Study our demographic. Who are the people we're trying to reach? What are they like? What's our community like? How is it different from what it was before? So I've kind of thrown a lot up there. I'll stop in a second here, but yeah, just try to get as clear on where we're at and paint a picture of what it could look like to go to a healthier place in the future and what that might look like, and give people an opportunity to join us.
That's been the best. It's been super helpful as someone who was on staff and then just a member of the church. And then obviously now I'm back on staff. But that was when I was on staff before. That's what it felt like. It felt like we had no like common thing other than just trying to follow Jesus well and help others follow Jesus well, like the big picture stuff.
Mm-hmm.
There was no like specific clarifying, like, this is where we're headed, or like
Yeah.
goal to work towards, or so,
Mm-hmm.
we were all kind of like, and I think other people on staff would describe this way, we were all kind of like in our own silo, like doing our own thing, as opposed to like collaborating and teamwork and like all moving towards a goal.
Yeah.
And so getting to know you over the years, like I feel like the Lord's really gifted you in a way to where you provide great organizational leadership, but you're also really good at casting vision
Mm-hmm.
of like, hey, this is something we want to shoot for, strive for. This is where we want to be headed. And you did it in such a way where, yeah, you included other people in that process. And it was this process of active listening and empathy and
Mm-hmm.
just hearing from the people, which is what pastors are in scripture referred to as a shepherd that cares for
Mm-hmm.
the sheep. And in that process, that just felt like that's what you were doing. Like, let me hear from the sheep what they're saying, and then
Mm-hmm.
let me as the shepherd lead them to a
Mm-hmm.
greener pasture through the Lord's guidance and Spirit's guidance. And so, yeah, for someone who's been a part of the church and worked on staff, like having that goal and a clear vision of where we're headed is so
Mm-hmm.
helpful, because then you can, anything that you're trying to start up or do, or new things that come up, you can ask the question like, okay, does this line up with where we're headed? And
Mm-hmm.
Johnny and I have talked about this even in your personal life with just like goal setting and like
Mm-hmm.
trying to get clear on purpose and passion and all that. But until you have an idea of where you're headed, it's really hard to set good goals that are in alignment with where you want to go, because you don't
Mm-hmm.
know what the end
Yep.
result is. So, there's a practice I did a couple years ago, and Johnny and I talked about it on here because I had him do it too, but writing your own obituary,
Mm-hmm.
thinking about like, what do I want to be remembered for when I'm not on this earth anymore? My time's done. Like that far out, thinking about where I want to be
Mm-hmm.
going. And then when you're setting like 1 year goal, 5 year goal, 10 year goal. You make sure it's in alignment with where you want to go ultimately. And I feel like that's what
Mm-hmm.
you've been able to do navigating change at our church is say, here's where we want to go long term.
Mm-hmm.
What are some goals and things we can put in the middle there that's going to help us get there? And that's just been so helpful. There was a quote from, I don't remember exactly who said it, but you were talking about when churches are declining or any organization is declining, there's all these reasons for, yeah, well, then this happened. And that's why, we dipped to here. And then this happened. That's why we dipped to here. And it's like, yeah, that's all great and whatnot. And I'm prone to do that as well to make things not sound as bad as they are. But
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, like, you have, you can give reasons or you could show results.
Yeah.
And you can give excuses or you can be like, all right, what are we going to do to turn this thing around and like get it going in the right direction? And that's the same with your personal life. Like as you're working towards goals, you can give excuses and you can give reasons for why you're not getting there or why you're not wanting to, or why you're not headed in the right direction. But at the end of the day, your results are going to show you if you're doing the right things or not. And so I like that you mentioned, the importance of measuring things too. And especially in a church context, because I feel like we like to over spiritualize things and be like,
Mm-hmm.
we don't need to track numbers. Like we just need, people to fall in love with Jesus and like be following him. And which is true. We do
Mm-hmm.
want that, but also the numbers do speak to something. Like I've found this helpful just goal setting in my own life. Like it's one thing to say, I want to do this, but then a lot of times like it never happens and then you're like, well, why didn't it happen? But you don't have a way to know because you weren't actually measuring something.
Yeah.
There wasn't like tangible numbers to it. And so for me, I set a goal this year to lose some weight, and part of that was like I was actually tracking on an
Mm-hmm.
app what I was eating, and it helped. And I would weigh, every week or every other week. So I had actual numbers to help me know, like, am I on track? Am I doing the right things? Or do I need to change and try something else? And it's been incredibly helpful. Like I've lost
Mm-hmm.
20 pounds, I think, since December, which is
Yeah, it's great.
great. That's awesome. So I say that to say, like, sometimes like tracking things and numbers and looking at
Yeah.
results get a bad rap, but ultimately that's just how you move towards
Yeah.
what you're trying to accomplish and
Yeah.
where God's moving you. So I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing all that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that comes to mind just with leading change?
Oh goodness, I could go on and on and on. I feel like I already have. But yeah, I mean, I think, one of the quotes that kind of sticks in my mind too around just kind of being afraid to talk about numbers. I think one of the Achilles heels of churches is confusing faithfulness with fearfulness. You know, like we want to say, oh, we're just being faithful. We're doing all the things that God's called us to do. When in reality, I think, at least in my experience, there's a lot of fearfulness of actually doing something that takes a little bit of courage and involves a little bit of risk and involves sticking yourself out there and committing to the kind of effort and investment that's going to yield some measurable
Hmm.
outcomes. We're just kind of afraid of that whole world. We want to label it with something spiritual that's called faithfulness and anything. I mean, you can make anything fit a definition of faithfulness just about. But at the end of the day, I mean, we're here. I mean, Jesus came on a mission, and if you go to the book of Acts in the New Testament, I mean, they weren't afraid to use numbers. I mean, they
Yeah.
counted meticulously people who were joining the mission. Like they knew. And so I think we're much more fearful about some of those things than even the biblical writers were, than Jesus was. So
Yeah.
yeah, I just think being objective and saying, yeah, I mean, unafraid to do the work.
Yeah. I think the tracking numbers and everything, what it sparks in us is a fear of failure. I
Mm.
think that's ultimately what's at the root
Yeah,
of it, because I felt that. But at the end of the day, like even if you do fail, you're gonna learn something from it. So like
yeah,
taking that risk, and if you fall, like part of life is just trying stuff, throwing stuff at the wall
yeah.
and seeing what sticks. And like you're
Hmm.
gonna get a lot of great stuff that comes out of that. But yeah, there are gonna be some duds that don't work out and some ideas that
Yeah,
don't pan out, but you learn from it and then you have a good idea that comes out of it. So
yeah.
yeah, I think a lot of that fear of just like putting numbers to things, tracking, measuring. I think it's just a fear of failure, or at least that's been my
Hmm.
experience. Maybe I won't speak for everybody, but
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes sense. I mean, that makes me even think, like in our context, probably a good thing for us as we try to implement more and more just clear, objective, measurable activities in our ministries is to intentionally give permission to fail. To
mhm,
say, hey, we're not going to shoot you down for not hitting this particular goal if you're putting in the right effort in the ways that you kind of have a hypothesis. If we do this, then our hope is that it'll result in this. If you put in your best effort on this and it results in something else, well, we can have a conversation about that. We can figure that out, and maybe we'll try something else and see if we
mhm,
can't, and just hold it loosely to try to take some of that fear out of it. Because I think you're
yeah,
right. I mean, I think ultimately, yeah, that fear of failure is a very real thing.
yeah. And I think that's another important piece of leadership is the importance of, and just like in relationships in general, but just that accountability to be able to say, like, and this is not specific to the church world. I mean, in organizations all over the place, they put in metrics, things they're tracking, activities they want people to do. And, I come from a sales background, so I think a lot in that terms of that. But, there's certain companies where it's like, you got to make this amount of phone calls a week, set up this amount of meetings, have this amount of lunch with a customer or whatever.
Hmm.
And there's all kinds of stuff like that. And they set those up that that is going to produce the type of results they're wanting to get. And so
Yeah.
they've had that proven over time, and they know that. I think, having that in place just makes sure that we are moving towards the goals that we're trying to achieve, and having that accountability in place creates that opportunity to have those conversations as a leader with, like, hey
Hmm.
man, you're knocking out of the park on doing these things and we're not seeing the results. And you know that just means we need to problem solve and come up with
Hmm.
maybe some different activities to do. And like,
Yep.
then it creates this collaborative conversation, which I think is really powerful. And so yeah, you've helped implement something at our church that I know a lot of businesses use, but I don't know that it's been used in church a lot, of EOS. And it has
Hmm.
just been incredibly helpful to me just to, yeah, do a lot of the things that we're talking about. And I'd recommend it to anybody really. And we're not doing it full stop yet, but
Yeah.
just the things that we have implemented have been extremely helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It just creates a framework to implement all these good things that we're talking about in a way that, is organized and sustainable and scalable, and, you can communicate out to everybody in a way that's cohesive. And a lot more churches are jumping on too. We've sort of created our own little EOS church cohort where we're talking about all the organizational principles of it applied specifically in the church context. And having, we've been at it for getting close to 2 years now. And it takes a while, like you said, to get all the parts, in place. So I think we're moving along at actually a pretty good pace of implementation. But more and more, I think, as we work through it, as I interact with other churches that are using it, as well as I went to a conference this past fall, which, I was the only church leader in our cohort of maybe 30 or 35 sort of senior leaders. And I mean, the things that they're wrestling with in their, whether it's a cleaning company or whatever it is, I came away going, oh, and we're a lot more alike than we are different. Um,
Hmm.
and it was fun to have
Yeah.
those kind of conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome.
But yeah, the book is traction. You read the book, you know what it's all about. So that's the thing to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. Well, and that was going to be my next question is, do you have
Yeah.
any books that are like your go-tos for just help with leadership?
Hmm. I mean, in the last couple of years, for sure, anything EOS related, and they have what they call the EOS library. The traction is their kind of main, start there. And then they've got 8 or 10 other books. So I've read several of those, and those are all good. Going back though, years ago, I read a book by a pastor. His name's Harry Reeder. He's recently passed. He was the lead pastor of a large Presbyterian church I want to say Alabama or Mississippi or something like that, but it's called The Leadership Dynamic. It's not a new book. I mean, it's a couple decades old, but he goes to, the New Testament, basically the Apostle Paul on leadership, and it's training leaders who can train other leaders who can train other leaders. And he just kind of teased it out in a way that I found really helpful and practical. And, he brings this good, solid, practical organizational leadership and uses kind of holds it up alongside biblical exposition, and you realize, man, there's a lot of overlap here. And so it's not a very big book. It's a smaller one that I've referred back to a lot over the years. Another one that was big for me is Pete Scazzero's leadership book, Emotionally Healthy Leadership. So he's also another pastor, and his thing is just emotionally healthy everything. So kind of he started his first work was emotionally healthy spirituality, but he has a book where he's applying it to leadership. That's been a super helpful one for me. Both started off because he tells a story of anxiety and the physical symptoms that when I first read his story, I was like, oh my goodness, like that spoke to me because that was right where I was at. And so kind of leading from a place of brokenness, authenticity, vulnerability, learning to have a healthy emotional relationship with your work and not kind of over identifying with it. So kind of all things mental and emotional health related to leadership. He was the first and probably the most consistent help to me. Now, since then, I've been introduced to a whole range of other things, but he continues to be kind of a go-to there. And that leadership, I mean, the first half of the book is sort of an internal assessment, and you working on yourself.
Mhm.
And then the second half of the book is more kind of leading a team, decision making, strategic planning, like all those other kind of categories. But they come out of a place of internal health, which when I first read it in 2015, 16, something like that. I mean, that's what helped me see. I was trying to piece together outward health and inwardly, like, I had no idea what was going on or what wasn't going on, mentally and emotionally that needed to be going on in order to be in a healthy place. So those are all ones that come to mind. Anything Patrick Lencioni has written, I think, is always good. He's another business guy, but just wise and oftentimes coming from a Christian perspective. I believe he's a Catholic, but there's a lot of overlap there in terms of worldview and value systems that come out in his books as well.
Well, I appreciate you sharing all those. If you're listening, make sure you write those down, add them to your Amazon wish list, and get to reading if you're wanting to grow in your leadership abilities. And I believe, and I've come to believe, that one of the most important um, jobs of a leader, one of the most important things a leader can do, is to lead with, and I think this is what younger generations are hungry for in leaders, but to lead with authenticity and vulnerability and honesty. And I've experienced the healing power of that in my own life, but I think if more and more leaders will start to embody that, then we'll start to see healing on a greater scale. And I just want to say how much I appreciate that you have led in that way. Like, I've seen you be vulnerable and be honest and on the stage, which can be an incredibly
Mm-hmm.
difficult thing to do. And, usually in ministry, there's like this line of like, how much do I share, or how much can I be vulnerable because I'm in this position and people
Mm-hmm.
look up to me? And but I've just appreciated how you've been willing to put yourself out there and to talk about the struggles that you've had. And I really do think that's one of the most, especially for just this next generation of people that you and I are going to be leading, they're desperate for that. And they're looking
Mm-hmm.
for that in their leaders. And so, you've talked about struggling with anxiety and, yeah, some of the physical, symptoms that came with that. So would you mind just, doing exactly what we were just talking about a little bit now and just share a little bit about that part of your
Mm-hmm.
story?
Yeah, for sure. And it dovetails with some of the things I was sharing earlier. So when I was leading that church and we realized we just didn't have the resources to have any, barring a very unusual miracle of God. Nobody wants to do, God could do anything. He could
Uh-huh.
resurrect from the dead, but he would have had to just about resurrect that church from the dead. Barring a miracle like that, there just was not any, meaningful reason to believe we were going to be able to continue. And I took that very, very personally. Like, I felt like it was a personal failure on my part. Like, I was not good enough to, I was not a good enough leader, was not a good enough preacher, probably didn't pray hard enough. Maybe I'm not really a Christian. Surely I shouldn't be a pastor. Like, it was a major identity crisis for me when I came to sort of recognize and accept that the church was in this place of failure. I mean, just call it what it is. I mean, at that moment, things were failing and failing fast. And the fact that I couldn't fix them broke me. And I didn't know how mentally and emotionally and ultimately physically, enmeshed I was with the church. And everything, good, bad, or otherwise, that happened to the church, I took as a personal thing. And so, I just poured my heart and soul and everything into that season. And when we were, considering this merge and talking to this other church and all the things, I mean, that meant a lot of things for leadership in our church to help get people, because we're a Baptist church in Northern Illinois, which is a rarity, but we were congregationally governed. We had to vote on, which we do in our church as well. So we had to vote on whether or not to make this big change in our church. And so we had, months of meetings, town hall meetings, individual meetings, small group meetings. I remember sitting across the desk with a founding member of our church talking about this proposal that the elders were bringing to become a part of this other church. Something I said I would never, ever do. When the idea was first proposed, I was like, there's no way I'm sitting across the desk from Joyce, was her name. I'm not sitting across the desk from Joyce telling her we're merging with another church. Sure enough, probably 3, 4 months later, I was doing exactly that. And so just the emotional investment, over investment, and just frankly the adrenaline that I sort of was riding to kind of pour into this. When it was all said and done, the church voted by a very narrow margin, but we voted positively to do this, and the decision had been made. We're going forward, and it was in the aftermath of that I just started to feel physical symptoms that I had never felt before. Like, my kids were young at the time. I remember sitting at a kindergarten orientation. It was in August of 2014. Sitting on the little kid chairs, in the classroom, and I remember feeling my right thigh, like it was like electrical pulses in my leg. And I'm sitting in this classroom with all these other parents and kids or whatever, and I'm like, start to like panic, like I gotta get out of here. Like, I'm freaking out just sitting in the room, like the walls are starting to come in on me, and my leg is like doing this weird thing, and I'm like, I gotta. And that was sort of the beginning of. I started to get dizzy spells. I remember one night we were sitting at home just watching a movie, and all of a sudden, like, I just get this overwhelming sense, like, you know, I'm having a heart attack. Like, my head's spinning, the room's starting to move, and I'm like, kind of freaking out. And I started to have these, kind of spells more and more frequently. Eventually, found myself in the emergency room one Monday morning with like sky high blood pressure, and they kind of give me on something to pull it down and make an appointment with your primary care doctor. Okay, so I do, and I'm talking to the doctor and kind of telling my whole story, and he kind of smiles at me, and he's like, "Yeah, the brain's a really powerful organ." And I got mad. I'm like, what are you talking about my brain? Like, this is my body. Like, it's not in my head. Don't tell me this is in my head. I mean, it turns out he was exactly right. I mean, so it's just, it was the beginning of a long journey of learning the interconnectedness of our physical bodies with our emotional health, with our mental health, with our spiritual health. So we talk all the time at our church around those categories of health: mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. And they're all connected. And I think, the long and short of it for me, and it goes to my childhood, my family of origin, all the things. We just never learned how to process emotion, And I come from a family. I mean, we're not a wearing emotions on our sleeve type of family. And honestly, I mean, I didn't think I had strong emotions. It just was a non-category for me. But what I had learned was I just didn't know how to identify them and process them. And so, I would think, I'm close to some people in my life who have experienced a lot of grief and loss, parents who died at an untimely age, or things that, just a lot of, easily identifiable grief and loss. And I hadn't experienced any of those things, I just thought, what, I just don't have any connection to those kinds of things. But what I've learned over the years is, it doesn't have to be a major life altering thing to be a meaningful category of things to grieve or losses to process. So like I got fired from a job, and never even had a category for like, what? I mean, that was a massive sort of disappointment. It was a loss of kind of what I was invested in, and what I thought things were going to look like at the time. That whole merge, I've learned. I mean, it was a loss of what I thought I was there to do. It was kind of certainly was a loss of like confidence. It was a big blow to my ego, but just there was all these whole categories of disappointments and losses and things to process through that had just accumulated over the years. And then, quite honestly, I mean, as a husband, just issues that my wife and I have, you know, any married couple over time. I mean, you got to work through issues. So there were unresolved issues in my marriage. There were unresolved issues in my parenting. There were unresolved issues just within me, just in my own self perception and self expectation. And so I think what happened in that moment was just the accumulation of all these unprocessed emotions. And this is what Pete Scazzaro kind of helped me put some words to. It just got too much. And at a certain point, and this was his story, your physical body just says enough. We're done with this, and it lets you know that your mental and emotional and spiritual health is not okay. And so the body kicks in and becomes the mouthpiece for overall health. And then you got to work with it then. You got to deal with it and process it. So a lot of things that God brought into my path, from 2014 through to today, really. But those first 6, 7 years was a real healing and growth and eye-opening time for me in all of these categories. And I mean, in parallel with growing as a leader. So I'm growing as an individual, as a husband, as a father, as a Christian, while growing as a leader. And, you know, again, those aren't like two mutually exclusive things. Like those two things have gone hand in hand. Yeah, so that's kind of what the last decade plus has looked like for me.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. And one thing I appreciated you saying is just how I feel like there's a stigma that usually people who are struggling with anxiety or depression or any
Mm-hmm.
sort of mental health illness, it's like, oh, they had something really traumatic happen to them
Yeah,
and that's what's causing it. But it
yeah,
doesn't have to be like this groundbreaking trauma you experience that is the root to it. Like it can
yeah,
be very simple things that over time can cause anxiety and
yeah.
depression and all the other things if it goes not dealt with. And
Mm-hmm.
so I appreciate you sharing that. And yeah, it's, I haven't experienced, well, I would say with my story, like I did experience losing sleep and there were definitely physical aspects of it. But yeah, the like leg thing, that's crazy. I've never heard of that before.
It's weird, yeah. And you realize, like, I mean, all of our bodies, I mean, you just feel sensations that you don't even think about. You
Yeah.
feel a little twinge of this or that. That, I think for when you're in a healthy place, you don't really think about it. When you're in an unhealthy place, everything is like, I'm having a heart attack. I'm having a stroke. Like,
Yeah.
it just, everything gets exaggerated, in your head. And, learned a thing or two about how to kind of bring myself down from that. But
Yeah.
it's taken some time.
Yeah. Well, and it's so cool too. Like
Yeah.
in the scriptures, we see God in Exodus as he's giving the law to Moses. One of the commands is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And it's
Hmm.
almost those four categories you were just talking
Hmm.
about. Like
Yeah.
mental is your mind, so mental health, heart, emotional health, spirit, spiritual health, and then
Hmm.
strength, physical health. And it's
Hmm.
it's just, I'm becoming increasingly aware that the biblical authors were way ahead of their time in this conversation and
Yeah.
have so much wisdom to offer us when it comes to mental health and us just being the men we were created to be and dealing
Yeah.
with the things that hold us back from that. There's so much wisdom in the scriptures that it's almost like God knew that all of
Hmm.
us would struggle with this one day, whether it was talked
Yeah.
about or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
No, I
and
think that's true.
it's encouraging too because the Bible talks about it. It doesn't
Yeah.
shy away from it, and I
Yeah.
think that is a challenge for us as well to be able to open up and talk about it. And so I
Yeah.
appreciate that you've done that at our church and even taking the time to do that here on our podcast. And so I'd love for our listeners just to hear some practical steps they maybe could take that have helped you. But what are some of the things you've encountered and experienced that have just helped you in wrestling with that anxiety?
Yeah. That's good. I mean, I think a lot of things, and helpfully, this isn't so taboo anymore. Like it's much more prominent. So like anything around the category of mindfulness, whether it's
Yeah.
from a Christian source or a non-Christian source, I mean, there's always fringes of everything that, probably take things too far, but just the core concept of mindfulness, self-awareness, sort of understanding what's happening below the surface in your own heart and mind, learning to connect to that has been huge for me. Just like your basic personality tests have been helpful for me. So, like on the Enneagram, I'm a three. Threes are obsessed with success and achievement. And that's helped me understand why I've been so driven. And the kryptonite for a three is failure.
Mm.
And so, this fear of failure, like you talked about earlier, has like torn me up without me even realizing it. So even just sort of getting to understand that personality assessment to realize, okay, well, that's a thing. I'm not alone. That's just a byproduct of the way God wired me. And there's also positives to that. And there are also ways that people with my same personality type can, you know, get healthy and watch out for some common pitfalls. Same thing with like, Myers Briggs and DISC and all the different, sort of personality. They each have their own angle or value that they bring, but help you get to know yourself. And that was my deal. I just didn't know myself like inwardly, internally, using those tools and kind of just embracing them. I mean, I've read, half a dozen Enneagram books, and then other different personality type things. So that's one thing. One of the strands of spiritual formation, again, Pete Scazzero is big into this. He's been helpful. We use his framework at our church of just building a rule of life that includes stepping away and slowing down and silence and solitude, taking a Sabbath, not just working all the time. And the answer to everything is more work. It just is this killer loop, right? That just exacerbates all these same issues. Um, and learning to be okay with that and giving myself permission to rest. Um, and I like, like Paul talks about in Philippians. He's like, not that I've accomplished these things, but I'm pressing on. I'm learning. That's kind of how it is. I mean, I've got way more to learn, than I have learned, but I've been on this path um, of just giving myself permission to not be productive for windows of time. John Mark Comer's big on this stuff now too. Of just, hey, in the long run, you're actually going to be more productive, more impactful, more effective if you balance your time. Some just basics. For some people, it's like, well, duh, but for
Yeah.
me, like, oh,
Yeah.
and what I mean, just recently I came across something that was like, trying to structure your day, your calendar, your week with, all right, here's when I'm going to go hard, you know,
Hmm.
deep, hard work, productivity, and here's where I'm going to shut it off, and I'm really going to rest and getting clear on what those how to be most effective in those times. Like, what are the times when you are able to rest and shut off because you don't have something to do the next day or whatever? What are the times when the energy level is best and the mental clarity is strongest to be your best productive? And it's different for everybody. Learning, like right now, that's kind of my front burner project is trying to learn my own rhythms of productivity. When am I at my best? When do I need to just shut it off? And the insight that I came across recently was like most of the time we live in this anxious middle where we're not really all that productive, but we're also not really resting. We're just kind of dabbling in both, not moving the ball forward all that well and
Yeah.
wearing ourselves out in the process. I
Yeah.
was like, well, that stinks.
Yeah.
That's kind of me. Too much of the time. Like we need to, we need to figure this thing out. Because you just get knocked around like a pinball.
Hmm.
So all these things, I think, just I came across a guy one time that his thing was treat your like, try to be like a personal investigator for how you operate. Like learn yourself and use all these tools, whether it's personality assessment stuff or spiritual formation things or just talking about it with other people and learning. You know, started Atomic Habits, a few months ago. That's been a
Hmm.
good input. Just kind of being a sponge for all of these sorts of things. And then, I mean, this makes me think this is going to get back to your reading question earlier. To me, most of these kinds of things are a pretty easy read.
Hmm.
Whereas in my day job, like preparing for sermons and things like that, like Bible commentaries are not usually an easy read.
Yeah.
More academic things, it just takes more discipline and grit to kind of get through. But I think for leadership, reading is hugely valuable because there's just so much information through just books of all kinds and articles and things like that. So improving my reading muscles, I have found, and I didn't do this intentionally, is just an observation. By reading a bunch of this, you know, stuff that's helping me learn myself, that's pretty easy reads, and I'm motivated to read it because I know how crappy anxiety feels and how, disabling it is. So I'm motivated. But as I'm consuming just more reading, that's not scrolling, that's not on a screen, that's actually on paper, I find it easier to read the harder stuff. Like I'm more effective. It's easier to read academic material and sort of heavier stuff if I'm reading more of this stuff over here. So for what it's worth, it also, I mean, it just kind of the rising tide is like lifting all the ships, and that's been
Yeah.
good.
That's awesome. Yeah, they're talking about switching back and forth, and most of us usually aren't like actually productive. I think it's called, they have a term for it. I think it's called task switching, but it's
Hmm.
actually more exhausting than, like, we're exhausting ourselves more by doing that. And what neurologically they've shown is, in order to be the most productive to where you're not wearing yourself out, you can only be like hyper focused on a task and productive towards the task for about 90 minutes max,
Hmm.
is kind of the research that's out there. And then they actually say you need a 15 to 30-minute break between
Hmm.
those 90-minute sessions. And
Hmm.
so for most of us, that's just a foreign concept. I remember the previous job I was at, I started implementing walks into my
Hmm.
day as that break for me. I wouldn't
Yeah.
take my phone, I wouldn't take headphones, and man, it was huge for me in being able to be productive and focused in the times I actually needed to get stuff done. But there were so many comments made about, like, oh, look at this guy, like he's going walking again, like, does this guy ever work? Or that's like the stigma
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
around
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But it's like, no,
Yeah.
God has set up the world in such a way where you need to rest in order to sprint.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's the
Yeah.
same with working out, right? Like, if you never take rest days lifting weights, like, you're eventually going to hurt yourself. And it's the same with work. It's the same with trying to be productive. Like, you have to take times of rest in order to actually
Hmm.
get done what you're wanting to accomplish. And so, yeah, it's cool that you're kind of exploring that. But I do think getting to know yourself is one of the most beneficial things somebody can do, especially if you're
Hmm.
struggling with mental health. I remember that was huge for me, just being able to put language to, like, how I'm wired and
Hmm.
why I do the things I do and why, I have the challenges that I have. And I also grew up in a family that didn't wear our emotions on our sleeve. And so I didn't have a whole lot of emotional intelligence, I feel like, growing up. And so, yeah,
Hmm.
reading and hearing from other people, and that, it's just helped open my eyes to the need for that and given me the ability to put language around, how I'm feeling and I used to just never be able to do that. I would just like brush things off, and then they would eventually bubble up later. So I resonate with a lot of what you said and what you're talking about. So yeah, I think for our listeners, like if anxiety is something you struggle with, looking inward and trying to get to the root of what some of that is can be incredibly valuable and incredibly helpful. And it you know, may not happen on the first article you read or the first video you
Yeah.
watch or first book you pick up, but the more you devote time to learning more about yourself and just talking about your experiences with other trusted people, you'll eventually start to experience healing. And I
Yeah.
think, Anson and I both know that from experience. And so
Yeah.
just want to encourage you that way. Anson mentioned some great resources briefly there, but do you have any more that you would say would be good for people to check out?
Well, if we're talking about anxiety, as you were talking just then, Xanax was a good friend of mine for a while,
Yeah,
you know,
medicine
and
can be helpful.
yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, and it helped, when I couldn't, so for me, it wasn't like, oh man, I got to get up and speak. I'm panicking because I'm nervous. Actually, I was most comfortable when I had to be on because my
Mm,
brain was occupied. You know,
yeah.
trouble was in mine, I'd be laying awake in the middle of the night and my brain's just going 1,000 miles an hour when it's not supposed to be, you know,
Hmm.
and it's like fixating on, telling me I'm having a heart attack. So it was like in the quiet. That's when, you know, I would freak out. And so, in the early days, I needed help. Like the first time the doctor prescribed a Xanax, which is, anxiety medicine that you take as needed. So I don't take it every day, but it's like you feel it, and I could just, it was like somebody poured honey on my brain. It was like,
Yeah.
and with enough repetition, when I would have these anxiety attacks, I would, mentally, I'd be like, okay, if I was really having a heart attack, that little low dose Xanax is not going to stop a heart attack.
Hmm.
And so that's literally what is like going on in my head. Like last time this happened, you took that little pink pill, you felt better, and it went away. You're feeling the exact same thing now. You're not having a heart attack because that would not, make that go away. And over time, I wouldn't need to take it because like my brain started to get, you know, convinced that, oh, okay, you're not having a heart attack. This is just anxiety. We can move on. And but for a lot of years, I didn't go anywhere without it in my bag.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciate you saying that because I know, we have listeners who have, yeah, they felt like they couldn't get traction on their own and they needed to,
Yeah.
take some medicine to help. And I
Hmm.
think that's valuable. And it doesn't work for everybody. I know people who've tried
Hmm.
medicine and it didn't go well for them, but when it does help, man, it's awesome. And
Like
so,
me.
yeah. And that's another thing. We encourage people at the church a lot. Like when they're thinking about getting plugged in and starting somewhere, like just pick something and give it a shot for a period of time. And if it doesn't
Hmm.
work, it's not like you're signing up to be committed to that thing for
Hmm.
forever. We want you to be involved in what you feel like is most lined up with who you are. And I think it's the same with trying to find ways to heal from anxiety or depression or whatever it may be. Is like you can be paralyzed by the fear of trying something new that and be afraid that it might not work, but like you'll never know unless you try. So like just start trying things for periods of time and don't give up. Like keep if something doesn't work, don't just stop there. Like keep looking for other ways and get advice from other people, ask
Hmm.
what they've tried. All of that is super helpful. When you're describing your thought process there, I was talking with a friend this week and she had some helpful questions that her therapist gave her when it comes to anxiety. And the first group of questions is about examining the evidence. So it's like when negative thoughts occur, we often accept them without examining them. They just are like, yeah, that's just the way it is. But if you ask, questions like, what's the evidence that supports my negative thoughts, or what's the evidence against my negative thought? Which side is more convincing, and what should I do now because of that? That's a way you can break yourself out of the anxiety trap, because it usually is a spiral. Like, once it starts going, it's hard to stop. But if you start to get curious about what's going on in your mind and just ask questions, and Johnny and I have said this quote from Ted Lasso, I don't know how many times on this podcast, but he tells this whole story and gives this quote where he says, "Be curious and not judgmental." And I think that applies to ourselves as well. It's not just with other people. When you have a negative thought, just don't make a judgment based off of it, but get curious and start to ask questions and see what evidence there is to support that. I found that to be a helpful way for me to break out of those anxiety loops as well. So
Yeah, I would affirm that for sure.
Yeah. Well, Anson, I appreciate you taking the time to come on and sharing your story and how to lead change and the lessons you've learned in leadership, but also navigating anxiety and how the Lord has molded and shaped you through those experiences as well. So thank you so much. And for our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this one and hope you can take some practical things that improve your life and help you make you be the man that you're created to be. And so as always, be like Anson, go be a dog today and go be there for your dogs.
Thanks for having me